My name is Sarah Whitman, and the night it all began, I didn't realize I was standing at the edge of losing my family. It was early October, the kind of crisp evening where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and fallen leaves. My husband, Daniel, had just turned 40, and we'd agreed to keep things simple takeout from that little Thai place we both loved. Maybe a movie, nothing extravagant. We'd settled into that post-dinner quiet dishes, clinking faintly in the sink, the hum of the fridge filling the space between our words. Then the doorbell rang. A package sat on the front step, plain brown cardboard. No ribbon, no wrapping paper, just a cheap happy birthday sticker slapped across the top like an afterthought. Daniel bent down, scooped it up, and carried it inside with the absent interest of someone expecting socks. He sliced the tape, reached inside, and pulled out a black velvet box. Sleek, almost too perfect. He flipped it in his hand, brow furrowing at its surprising weight. "That's from your parents," he said, glancing at the shipping label. Something in my stomach knotted tight. I didn't know why yet, but the air shifted the way it does right before lightning splits the sky. Daniel thumbed at the lid, about to open it. "Don't touch it," I said. He froze, looking at me like I'd suggested storing it in the freezer. "What?" "Please," I repeated, my voice lower now. "Just don't." It wasn't logic. It was instinct. A quiet alarm in the back of my mind, faint, but unignorable. My hands, still damp from rinsing dishes, trembled as I took a clean towel off the oven handle, wrapped it around the box, and set it carefully on the counter like it might lunge. Daniel didn't laugh. That's how I knew he felt it too. Not the specifics, but the wrongness. I snapped a photo of the box, clean angle, clear lighting. Not for memories, for documentation. Then I searched. Brand logo, serial number, price. It didn't take long. $3,800? I felt my throat tighten. My parents could barely cover their utility bills some months. I'd been helping them for years, quietly, automatically, because that's what you do when you're the responsible one. A gift like this wasn't generosity. It was a message. Or worse, it was leverage. I could feel Daniel watching me, waiting for me to say it out loud. But I didn't. Not yet. I just stared at the towel-wrapped box on the table between us and the distance it seemed to create in the room. I didn't know then that this was the first domino, that within weeks the lines between family loyalty and moral integrity would blur so badly I'd be forced to choose which one survived. And before I tell you how far it went, tell me, where are you listening from? Right now, I'd love to know who's here with me tonight, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Because if you think a velvet box can't blow a family apart, you're about to see how wrong that is. The weight of that price tag sat heavy in my chest all night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the streetlight outside flickering across the wall. Daniel slept beside me, steady breaths that said he'd made peace with letting me figure it out. But I couldn't let it go. Every dollar my parents didn't have. Every bill I'd quietly paid for them. They all stacked up in my mind like a spreadsheet of sacrifices. A $3,800 watch didn't fit anywhere on that ledger. By morning, I'd decided I wasn't going to sit on it. I brewed coffee, burnt the toast again, and kept glancing at that black velvet box still wrapped in the tea towel. It was like a third person in the kitchen, silent, but demanding attention. Daniel set his mug down. "Are we going to talk about it?" "Not yet," I said. "I need to see them first." He didn't push. That's one thing about Daniel, he's not the type to pry before I'm ready. But he also wasn't smiling, and that said more than words. The drive to my parents' place felt longer than it should. Our little town isn't big 5 stoplights, 2 diners, 1 sad strip mall, but the wait in the car made every block stretch. I kept replaying scenarios in my head. Maybe they'd won a contest. Maybe someone had passed away and left them something. Maybe... No, I didn't believe any of those maybes. When we walked in, they were both in the kitchen. Mom sat at the table, shuffling through a pile of unopened mail. Dad stood by the counter, scrolling his phone, a spreadsheet open on the laptop beside him like it was for show. They looked up at the same time, surprise flickering across their faces before the polite smile set in. "You're here early," Mom said. "We need to talk," I replied, holding the towel-wrapped box in both hands. Dad's smile faltered. "What's that?" "You sent it," I said. They exchanged a look, quick, sharp, like two people checking whether the other had told the same lie. "It's a birthday gift," Mom offered. I set it on the table between us. A $3,800 birthday gift. Dad's eyes narrowed. "You checked the price?" Of course I did. My voice was steady, but my palms were slick. "Because it doesn't make sense. You couldn't afford to fix your boiler last winter. I paid that bill, so tell me where the money came from." They didn't answer right away. Dad leaned back in his chair. Mom busied herself stacking the mail. That silence, it was worse than a confession. "I'm not leaving until you tell me," I said. Dad sighed like I was being dramatic. "It's just a gift. We wanted to do something nice for Daniel." I laughed once, but it came out flat. Is generosity a crime? No. But unexplained money is a problem. And this I tapped the box isn't random. Still nothing. That's when I decided we weren't going to dance around it anymore. I took a deep breath and said, "I need you both to understand something. This isn't about a watch. This is about trust. If there's something I should know about where this came from, about why it showed up now, you need to tell me before I find out another way." Dad's jaw tightened. Mom's hands froze mid-stack. For the first time, they looked nervous. I leaned forward, lowering my voice, because I will find out. The air in the room thickened, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. And I realized this wasn't just about the watch. This was about every unspoken truth between us, every time I'd chosen silence over confrontation. Not this time. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to know, have you ever been given a gift that made you more suspicious than grateful? Share it in the comments. I think you'll be surprised how many people have a story like that. What came next proved my instincts weren't just right. They were years overdue. Growing up in my house was like living in two different families, under the same roof. There was the world my younger brother Mark lived in, light on rules, heavy on second chances, and then there was mine, lined with chore charts, report cards, and the constant reminder that if something went wrong, I'd better have an explanation ready. I was the fixer, the one who knew where the emergency flashlight was, how to unclog the sink, and how to keep the electric bill from bouncing. Mark was the dreamer, drifting from one big idea to another, like he was auditioning for the role of a misunderstood genius. He dropped out of college twice once, forgetting he was even enrolled. He'd land part-time jobs, then lose them when the novelty wore off. And every time my parents smoothed it over, telling anyone who asked that Mark just hadn't found his calling yet. Me, I was expected to already have mine, and to pay for theirs. By the time I was 25, I'd quietly started covering my parents' phone bills. A few years later, I was picking up their car insurance, their heating costs in the winter, sometimes even their groceries. Not because they asked, but because it was easier than watching them struggle and pretend they weren't. When Daniel came into my life, nothing really changed on that front. He knew my parents weren't well off. He didn't know the exact extent of my financial support, because I never framed it as charity. I framed it as helping family. That's what you do, right? You step up. You fill in the gaps. Mark, on the other hand, never seemed to notice those gaps at all. When he moved out for the first time, it was into an apartment paid for, partly by a business venture he claimed was too confidential to discuss. He came back within 6 months. This pattern repeated enough that it became its own inside joke, just not one I laughed at. Now, sitting in my parents' kitchen with that watch between us, I could feel the old dynamic tightening like a vice. My dad's refusal to explain the money didn't just smell like a bad deal, it smelled like Mark. I decided to test the waters. "Does Mark know about this?" I asked casually. Mom's head jerked up. Dad's eyes flicked toward the hall like Mark might materialize if we said his name too loudly. "That's not relevant," Dad said. Which, in my family, was code for "it's exactly relevant." I leaned back, my chair creaking. "It's funny. I've spent years making sure you didn't have to choose between paying bills and buying groceries. And yet, here we are with a luxury watch on my kitchen counter. Forgive me if I don't think this came from a place of pure generosity." Mom's lips thinned. "You make it sound like we've done something wrong." I held her gaze. "I think you've done something risky. And I think Mark's involved." The silence after that wasn't empty, it was loaded. I could practically hear the unspoken conversation between them, the one I wasn't supposed to hear. In that moment, something shifted in me. For years, I'd played my role, shouldering responsibility without asking for much in return. But this wasn't just about carrying their weight anymore. This was about them dragging me and Daniel into something that felt dangerous. I thought about the years of covering for Mark, the excuses I'd made for my parents, the nights I'd rearranged my own bills to make sure theirs were paid. And now all of that goodwill was wrapped around a ticking problem disguised as a gift. I looked at Daniel, who was still quiet, still watching, but whose jaw was tight enough to crack a tooth. He didn't need to say it. We were thinking the same thing. If this watch was a thread pulling, it would unravel more than we wanted to see. But the thing about threads is once you notice them, you can't unsee them. And I just decided I was going to pull. Daniel and I built our life on something my parents never quite understood: work that didn't make you rich but made you proud. When we first met, he was running a soup kitchen out of a church basement. No big donors, no shiny sponsorship banners, just a few borrowed folding tables, a couple of battered crockpots, and an unwavering belief that no one should go to bed hungry. I started volunteering on weekends, peeling potatoes, brewing coffee, and serving plates to people who'd learned to expect nothing from the world. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Over time, the operation grew not fast, not with any sudden influx of money, but with word of mouth and a handful of generous locals who believed in the mission. We expanded to a second location, then a third. By the time Daniel and I got married, the shelter wasn't just his project, it was ours. When my parents started inching toward retirement, their finances already looked shaky. Mark was still living at home, bouncing between business ventures that existed mostly on his laptop screen. Daniel and I thought we were offering them a lifeline when we suggested part-time roles at the charity, simple admin work, event coordination, basic outreach. Nothing high pressure, something that could help them earn a bit of income and feel connected to the community. For a while it worked. Mom handled phone calls and donor thank you notes. Dad kept spreadsheets and assisted with supply orders. They were part of the team. I thought naively that meant we were all on the same side. 6 months in, Dad came to us with what he called an opportunity. He'd found a new food supplier, locally owned, healthier ingredients, better prices. He'd even done taste tests, according to him. The numbers he showed us looked good, and we were running on such tight margins that any savings felt like a win. Daniel asked a few questions: storage practices, delivery schedules, but nothing raised red flags. I remember thinking it was one of the first proactive moves Dad had made for the charity, so we signed the contract. At the time, I didn't notice the way Dad seemed unusually satisfied, almost smug, like a man who just pulled off something clever and was waiting for applause. I just thought he was proud to contribute. Looking back, that was the moment the rot began. It started small clients mentioning that the food tasted different. I brushed it off as people adjusting to a new supplier. But then the complaints shifted: stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting. And finally, one man ended up in the ER for dehydration after eating nothing else for 2 days. Daniel was furious. He dove into invoices, ingredient lists, supplier records, and what he found made him sick, literally. Cheap cuts of meat passed off as premium expired canned goods, relabeled produce with no clear origin. And yet the invoices billed us as if it were all top tier. When he confronted my parents, the reaction wasn't relief that we'd caught a problem. It was resistance. They insisted the supplier was fine, that people were exaggerating, that ending the contract would ruin business relationships. That was when the first real crack in my trust appeared. They weren't defending the charity, they were defending the supplier. I didn't know yet why, but I knew enough to realize that whatever had gotten them tangled up in this, it wasn't just about food. And when the watch showed up days before Daniel was set to pull the plug on the deal, I stopped believing in coincidences altogether. If you've ever worked years to build something only to feel someone inside your own circle might be risking it. Tell me in the comments, I want to hear how you handled it. Because what happened next, that was when the gloves came off. The day Dad pitched the new supplier is burned into my memory like a scene from a movie I didn't know was foreshadowing the twist. He walked into the office carrying a thick manila folder tucked under his arm, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "I've got something for us," he said, dropping the folder onto Daniel's desk. "Healthier, cheaper, and local. I've done the math, this will save us thousands a year." Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed but curious. "All right, show me." Dad flipped through glossy brochures, photos of fresh produce so bright, they looked airbrushed cuts of meat laid out like they belonged in a gourmet catalog. The price sheets were neatly printed, the figures highlighted in yellow. On paper, it looked like a miracle. I remember standing behind Daniel, looking over his shoulder and thinking, maybe this was Dad's way of proving he could contribute something big to the shelter. We'd been running tight on funds for months. Every penny mattered. Daniel asked the right questions. Who's their distributor? Where do they source? Dad had quick answers, confident answers, almost rehearsed. He even claimed he'd sampled their products himself. "They're practically neighbors," he said, tapping the page. "And they want to support a local cause. It's a win-win." Daniel and I exchanged a glance. I could see the hesitation flicker in his eyes, but the numbers were hard to ignore. We agreed to a trial contract. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed out of place. The deliveries arrived on time. The boxes were labeled neatly. And then, little by little, the comments began. This chili doesn't taste the same. The meat's chewy. Did you switch the coffee brand? It's bitter now. At first, I brushed it off. Change always gets pushback. But then came the stomach cramps, the food poisoning complaints, the trip to the ER. That's when Daniel dug in, pulling invoices and cross-checking them against the food we were receiving. The picture that formed was ugly. Expired canned goods with reprinted labels, off-brand produce sold at premium prices, cuts of meat swapped for the cheapest available. When Daniel brought it to Dad, the reaction wasn't concern, it was annoyance. You're overreacting, Dad said. People get sick. It doesn't mean it's the food. Daniel's voice sharpened. One man was hospitalized. You want to gamble with that happening again? Mom chimed in from the corner. It's a misunderstanding. Let it go. We've built a relationship with them. It's not worth burning bridges over a few unhappy customers. Daniel and I shared that silent, heavy look, the one that says, this is bigger than we thought. I walked away from that conversation unsettled, but not yet ready to accuse. Instead, I started quietly asking questions about the supplier, about their contracts, about how Dad even found them. That's when I realized something that made my skin prickle. There was no mention of them anywhere in our usual vendor circles. They didn't seem to exist outside the paperwork Dad had brought us. And right there, I knew I was dealing with more than a bad business decision. This was a setup. What about you? Have you ever had someone close bring you an opportunity that felt too good to be true? Share your story below. I think more of us have been there than we realize. I didn't know it then, but the watch was already on its way. And when it arrived, it would turn suspicion into certainty. The first serious complaint landed on my desk 3 months after we'd signed with Dad's miracle supplier. It was a handwritten note from one of our regulars, a retired Navy vet named Carl, who came in twice a week. He wrote that the stew tasted off, and that within hours of eating, he'd been doubled over with cramps. I remember reading it twice, then a third time, trying to decide if it was just bad luck or a pattern starting to emerge. 2 days later, Maria, one of our volunteers, pulled me aside in the kitchen. You might want to check the meat in the walk-in, she said, wrinkling her nose. It doesn't smell right. That same week, we had 3 more reports of nausea and vomiting from people who'd eaten with us. And then came the call that dropped like a hammer. One man had been hospitalized for dehydration after eating nothing but our food for 2 days. Daniel hit his limit. I watched him turn from calm administrator to relentless investigator overnight. He called every shelter and outreach partner we'd served that month, asking if they'd had complaints. He demanded full ingredient lists from the supplier, pulled every invoice, and started matching them against the products sitting in our pantry. What he found made my stomach churn. Whole shipments of produce without origin labels. Cans with expiration dates that had clearly been altered. Meat that was billed as high grade but looked and tasted like the cheapest bulk cuts you could find. When Daniel confronted Dad, I thought maybe this was the moment Dad would be horrified that he'd admit he'd been duped. Instead, his reaction was almost hostile. You're making a mountain out of a molehill, Dad said, waving off the evidence. People get sick all the time. It's flu season. Daniel's jaw tightened. One man ended up in the ER. That's not flu season. That's poison. Mom jumped in, then her voice sharp. You don't just break a contract over a few complaints. This is business. You think Michelin stars matter here? We're running a charity, not a 5-star restaurant. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but his tone could have cut glass. We're feeding people who have nowhere else to eat. We owe them more than expired cans and mystery meat. The more they pushed back, the more obvious it became that they weren't just protecting the supplier, they were protecting themselves. Their arguments weren't about the clients or even the charity's reputation. They were about relationships and deals and looking bad if we backed out. By the end of that meeting, Daniel and I agreed privately the contract had to go. We'd eat the financial hit, but we couldn't serve another plate of that food. We were days away from sending the termination notice when the package arrived. It was the same brown cardboard I'd see later with that cheap birthday sticker and the black velvet box inside. The timing was so precise it didn't feel like coincidence, it felt like choreography. And in my gut, I knew the watch wasn't a gift. It was a signal. Before we move on, I want to ask, if you found out someone in your family was putting others in harm's way, would you confront them directly or try to fix it quietly? Leave your thoughts below. Your answers might surprise even you. The next few days would strip away whatever hope I had that this was just a misunderstanding. The decision to end the contract was made in the quiet way Most big decisions are not with shouting or slamming doors, but with a single tired sentence from Daniel over our kitchen table. We can't keep feeding people this stuff. I nodded, already knowing what it would mean. Financially, it would sting. Replacing a supplier on short notice isn't easy, especially for a charity running on donations and goodwill. But reputationally, that was the bigger gamble. You can recover from a bad balance sheet faster than you can from the whisper that you've been careless with the most basic trust feeding people safely. Daniel started drafting the termination letter. I was looking over the wording when Mom called her voice light and casual, in that way she uses when she's hiding something. Before you make any decisions, come by the office, she said. Your father wants to talk. That was unusual. My parents weren't the call a meeting type. If they wanted to see me, they'd drop by unannounced with a pie from the grocery store bakery and a dozen passive-aggressive comments about my hair or my furniture. When we walked in, they were already waiting in the staff room. Neutral ground, no clients or volunteers around. Dad had that salesman's smile on the one that doesn't touch his eyes. I think we're overreacting, he began. The suppliers had a few hiccups, but nothing that can't be fixed. I crossed my arms. Hiccups don't put people in the hospital. He sighed dramatically. We've built a relationship with them. They're local. They believe in what we're doing here. Ending the contract now would look bad. We'd lose face. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. I'd rather lose face than lose someone's life. It was the kind of line that should have ended the conversation. But instead, Dad's jaw hardened. You don't understand business relationships. I felt my temper rise. And you don't understand that this isn't a business, it's a charity. We exist to serve people, not to protect deals that hurt them. Mom's tone went cold. It's not as simple as that. It was in that moment, right there in the middle of that bland staff room with the flickering fluorescent light, that I realized they weren't going to back down. No amount of evidence, no stack of invoices, no hospital records would sway them. So we stopped trying to convince them. We moved forward with the termination. 2 days later, the watch arrived. Daniel had been planning to spend his birthday evening with takeout and a movie. Instead, he was standing in our kitchen, holding a black velvet box that weighed far more than it should. The shipping label had my parents' names on it. From them, he said. That was when instinct took over. Don't touch it. The next morning, after a silent breakfast, we drove to the office with the watch still wrapped in a dish towel. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going there to work, I was going there to draw a line. Have you ever had to stand your ground against people you love? Tell me in the comments. It's harder than most realize, but sometimes it's the only choice you get. What happened when we placed that watch on the table would change everything. The watch sat between us like a live grenade. Wrapped in that faded blue dish towel, it didn't look like much, just a bundle of fabric on the table in the staff room. But I knew better. I knew what was inside, and I knew what it meant. Daniel placed it down gently, as if setting a trap he didn't want to spring. I slid 2 plain white envelopes across the table toward my parents. They watched them land without touching them, their expressions unreadable. What is this? Dad asked finally. Open it, I said. He did. So did Mom. I watched their eyes flick back and forth across the pages, formal, polite, and absolute. Termination of their positions at the charity, 1 month's pay, no further involvement. Mom looked up first, her face pinched like she'd just bitten into something sour. You're firing us. Yes, I said, exactly like that. The scrape of Dad's chair against the linoleum was loud enough to make me flinch. He stood looming over the table. We're your family. I met his glare without blinking. Not anymore. Not like this. His voice rose. We've done nothing wrong. No, I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and tapped the screen until the listing for the watch appeared, brand, model, and price $3,800 in bold. I said it in front of them. Want to explain where this came from? You couldn't even afford to repair your boiler last winter. I paid that bill for you. So, again, where did the money come from? They were silent. I pressed on. You didn't just send a gift. You sent something designed to tie Daniel to that supplier. You knew what people would think if they saw him wearing it. Dad shrugged. It was a gift. Mom's voice was sharper now. Is generosity a crime? No, I said, leaning forward. But bribery is, and you know the difference. That cracked something. They both started talking at once, fast defensive, tripping over each other. You don't understand how hard it's been. The supplier's legitimate. We were just trying to support your brother. That last part stopped me cold. What does Mark have to do with this? I asked. Dad clamped his mouth shut. Mom looked away. The pieces clicked. Mark's sudden move into a new apartment. His vague startup no one could explain. Dad's insistence on pushing this supplier through, the resistance to ending the contract even when people were getting sick. You had something to gain from that deal, I said. Mom crossed her arms. We didn't do anything illegal. You put Daniel in danger, I shot back. You put the charity in danger. For what, a paycheck, a favor for Mark? Dad's voice dropped to a low growl. Do you want to scrape by your whole life while other people make real money? And in that moment, I saw it clearly this wasn't about helping people for them. It was about making deals, cutting corners, and getting ahead no matter who got hurt. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. No more calls, no more favors. We're done. Leave now. They didn't slam the door when they left. They just walked out quiet and slow, like they'd realized the shift was permanent. If you've ever had to tell someone you love that the relationship is over, you know that silence afterward isn't peace. It's the sound of something breaking for good. Tell me your story in the comments. But I didn't know the real confrontation was still coming because Mark wasn't going to let it end there. I didn't even have a full day to process the fallout with my parents before the pounding started on our front door. Not knocking, pounding like someone was trying to break it down or make a point. When I opened it, Mark stood there flushed and breathing hard like he'd sprinted the whole way. His eyes darted past me immediately. Is he here? Daniel stepped into view from the hallway, calm, but with that stillness he gets when he's bracing for something ugly. Why don't you tell us what this is about? He said. Mark rolled his eyes. You know exactly what this is about. You canceled the contract. I folded my arms. That's right. You weren't supposed to, he snapped. You were supposed to stay quiet and just let it run. Now the deal's off and we've got people asking for their money back. That word we landed like a lead weight. Who, I asked. He hesitated just long enough to give himself away. People who paid up front. Now that the contract's dead and we didn't deliver, they want all their money. And they're not exactly the kind of people who send polite emails. The picture came into focus sharp and ugly. So let me get this straight, I said. You took money from someone to push that deal through, and now that we refuse to poison people with expired food, we're the problem. Mark's voice went defensive. I didn't know the food was bad. Of course you didn't, I said my words ice. Because you never ask questions when money's involved. He crossed his arms, squaring his stance like he thought that would make him seem in control. I'm going to have to sell my apartment. I didn't even blink. Maybe you shouldn't have bought it with money that wasn't yours. His face twisted. I was helping the family. Daniel stepped forward, then his tone calm but razor sharp. No, you were helping yourself. Silence stretched thick between us. Finally, Mark spoke again, quieter this time. If you bring the supplier back, this can still be fixed. I shook my head. We're not bringing them back. He looked at Daniel. You should think about what happens if you don't. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Was that a threat? It's a fact, Mark said, and then turned on his heel. We didn't slam the door, but the air felt heavier after it closed. I knew this wasn't over, not because of guilt or family loyalty, but because Mark had just warned us in his own twisted way there were more players in this game than we'd seen yet. If you've ever had someone try to leverage fear to get what they want from you, you know it's a line you can't uncross. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know if you think we should have called the cops right then. But I didn't have to wait long for the answer. The next move was already in motion, and it was about to hit us, where it hurt most, our reputation. It started like a slow leak, small, almost unnoticeable, then turned into a flood before we could plug the hole. 3 days after Mark's visit, our phones started buzzing with messages from friends, donors, even volunteers. Have you seen this one message read followed by a blurry screenshot? It was the watch that watched sitting in its velvet box photo clearly taken in our kitchen. The caption under it read, "Ask them where the Rolex came from." At first I thought it was some random internet troll, but then I saw the pattern. The same photo appeared on local Facebook groups, old community forums, and even in comments under our charity's social media posts. The wording varied, but the implication was always the same, that Daniel and I had been skimming donations using charity funds to buy luxury items for ourselves. Then came the more venomous ones. You think the homeless are getting fed, they're feeding themselves. Anonymous accounts kept popping up, brand new profiles with no history, all posting the same kind of accusations. And it worked. 2 of our regular sponsors paused their donations pending clarification. A charity event we'd been planning quietly pulled out. In the staff kitchen, I found our volunteer coordinator sitting at the table with her head in her hands, crying. People are calling me, asking if I knew, if I was part of it. Daniel's jaw was tight for days. He barely slept, spending hours fielding calls from concerned donors, trying to reassure them without sounding defensive. Every time the phone rang, I felt that sinking dread in my stomach. Then the call came from a number I didn't recognize. "This is the State Department of Charitable Oversight," the voice said politely. "We've received anonymous tips regarding mismanagement of funds in your organization. We'd like to schedule a review." They were calm, almost kind, but I knew what that really meant. Someone was trying to drag us into an official investigation. When I hung up, Daniel didn't ask what the call was about. He just looked at me with that quiet knowing, the kind that comes when you've been through enough storms together to recognize the next one forming on the horizon. The next morning, an email arrived. No greeting, no sign-off, just one sentence. "If the supplier is reinstated and our positions restored, the attacks will stop." I read it 3 times. By the 4th, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the audacity was so absurd it tipped into surreal. Daniel sat down next to me. "We should report it." I nodded. "Tomorrow morning." We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house felt like an accusation. Every ping from my phone felt like another grenade tossed over the wall. If you were in my shoes, would you have gone straight to the police? Or tried to negotiate just to stop the bleeding? Let me know in the comments, because from where I stood, there was only one way forward. And the moment we walked into that police station, the story began to change. The police station smelled faintly of burnt coffee and damp paper. We carried everything in with us: emails, supplier invoices, photos of the watch screenshots of the social media attacks, even handwritten statements from volunteers who'd overheard my parents pushing the supplier. The officer who took our statement didn't flinch. Not when we mentioned my parents, not when we explained the food poisoning cases, and not when we read the blackmail email out loud. She just kept her pen moving across the report form. When we finished, she closed her notebook and looked at us squarely. "You're not the first," she said. "We've been seeing more of this contracts tied to kickback suppliers buying influence through family members. It's messy, but you did the right thing by coming in." Her tone was matter of fact, but I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because we weren't overreacting. Dread because "you're not the first" meant we were part of a pattern, one where people didn't always come out unscathed. We left with a case number, a promise of follow-up, and the gnawing sense that this was about to get a lot uglier before it got better. That night, Daniel and I sat in the office, long after the staff had gone home. The fluorescent light hummed above us. On the wall behind my desk, the bulletin board still held the event flyers we'd been so excited about just weeks earlier. Now they felt like relics from a different life. Daniel broke the silence first. "You know this is going to be public if it goes anywhere." I nodded. "I know. Your parents made their choice," I finished for him, "and so did I." There was no going back after that. We both knew it. 3 months later, the first subpoenas went out. 6 months later, the headlines hit: "Local charity leaders indicted in bribery and fraud scheme." My parents' mugshots were on the evening news. The details came out in court. The supplier had wired $15,000 directly into my father's account, just weeks before the contract was signed. The watch had been part of the same bribe package, and a portion of that money had gone to help Mark put down the deposit on his shiny new apartment. The catering company itself turned out to be a hollow shell propped up by fake invoices and a network of shady subcontractors. Its CEO pled guilty and took a year in federal prison plus fines and a revoked business license. My parents weren't so lucky, or maybe they were. They got 18 months in prison, $50,000 in fines, and the complete implosion of their reputation. No more neighborly waves at the post office, no more potluck invitations. Mark got probation and 200 hours of community service, ironically at a food bank. The apartment was seized. The business partners he'd been protecting vanished. For our part, Daniel and I were cleared officially, publicly. The state issued a statement confirming we'd cooperated fully, that the charity was in good standing. Donors started to return. Volunteers came back. The day the board voted unanimously to reaffirm Daniel's leadership, I walked into the staff kitchen to find fresh coffee brewing and people laughing again. For the first time in months, the air felt clean. If you've ever been through a fight that took everything out of you, you know the strange quiet that comes after. Tell me in the comments, was it worth it for you? For me, it was. But the real closure came later, when I realized I could sleep through the night without waiting for the next knock on the door. If you think the story ended with the court sentences, you'd be wrong. Publicly, yes, the case was closed. Headlines moved on to the next scandal, the next political squabble, the next weather disaster. But behind the scenes, the embers still burned. It started with letters handwritten, smudged, no return address. Some were obviously from my parents, even though they didn't sign them. The tone swung wildly from apologetic, "We just want to explain," to bitter, "You destroyed your own family for strangers." I didn't reply to any of them. Then came the messages from people I didn't even know, old family acquaintances, distant cousins lecturing me about loyalty and blood ties. I deleted them all. And yet, despite the noise, something inside me had shifted. I didn't flinch when people brought up the trial anymore. I didn't stumble over explanations or soften the truth. I'd say it plainly, they broke the law. We protected the charity. Daniel was the same. If anything, he was even more resolute, refusing to let any trace of shame creep in. "We feed people who have nothing," he'd say. "If that makes us the bad guys in someone else's story, so be it." One evening, about a month after the sentencing, I stayed late at the shelter to help with inventory. The place was quiet, except for the sound of the fridge humming. When I stepped out to the parking lot, I saw a familiar shape leaning against the side of the building. Mark. He looked thinner, the cocky edge gone from his posture, but his eyes were still sharp. "You think you won?" he asked without preamble. "I think I kept people safe," I said. He gave a humorless laugh. "You've made enemies you don't even know about. And you've already met them, haven't you?" I shot back. He didn't answer. Instead, he straightened up, shoved his hands into his pockets, and walked away into the dark without another word. For a long moment I stood there, the cool night air pressing in on my skin. I knew he meant it as a warning, maybe even a threat, but it didn't land the way he intended. I wasn't afraid anymore. Because here's the truth: once you've faced the choice between protecting what's right and protecting what's comfortable, and you've chosen right, there's a kind of armor that forms. It's not arrogance, it's clarity. And clarity is something no one can take from you. What about you? Have you ever had someone try to intimidate you after you stood your ground? Drop your story below. I think we need to start talking more about what it really costs to do the right thing. Little did I know one last twist was still waiting for me, one that would turn closure into something far more permanent. The last twist arrived in the most ordinary way through the mail slot. It was a thick, official-looking envelope with no return address. Inside was a single typed page. "If the supplier is reinstated and our positions restored, all attacks will stop. This is your only chance." No greeting, no signature, just that. I read it once, twice, then a third time. The audacity was staggering, not just because of the demand itself, but because they thought this would still work after everything. After the trial, after the sentences, after the damage they'd already done. Daniel walked in as I was staring at the page. He read it over my shoulder and didn't even bother to sit down. "We take this to the police," he said. For the second time in less than a year, we found ourselves walking into the station with a folder full of evidence. The same officer was on duty. She took one look at the letter and shook her head slowly. "Some people don't know when to quit," she said, clipping it into our case file. That might have been the end of it, except 2 days later, a donor forwarded me an email they'd received. It was from a brand new account, but the language was unmistakable attacks on our credibility, hints that we were hiding the real story. A blurry attachment of the same watch photo that had started it all. It was like watching the ghost of an old fire try to spark back to life. But this time, it didn't catch. Our donors had heard the truth directly from us. The regulators had cleared us publicly. The press had already told the story, and people had moved on. Still, I didn't ignore it. I sent everything, every email, every screenshot to our lawyer and the police. A week later, I got the call the sender had been traced back to a public computer in the prison library. My parents hadn't written it themselves, but someone connected to them had. The warden promised it would be handled. That was the real end, not with an explosion, but with a slow fizzle as the last embers finally died out. For the first time since the watch appeared on my doorstep, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. The noise had stopped. The shadows were gone. And the people trying to manipulate us had run out of moves. If you've ever had to deal with someone who just won't let go, you know there's a special kind of relief when you realize they finally have no power left. Let me know in the comments, what was the moment you knew you were free? I thought that would be my final lesson in all this. But there was one more thing I had to face, the public moment, where the truth would be laid bare for everyone to see. 6 months after the police traced that last desperate email, the story hit the headlines again, this time in full, with every detail laid out for anyone who wanted to read it. The local paper ran it on the front page: "Charity leaders cleared bribery ring, exposed." A regional magazine picked it up, and even a morning radio show did a segment. They called it a family betrayal that became a fight for integrity. The facts were now public record. The catering company was a shell operation with a fake local face set up to funnel low-grade expired food at premium prices. In exchange for pushing the contract through, my father received a $15,000 bank transfer and that $3,800 watch delivered conveniently just before Daniel was supposed to sign off on renewing the deal. Some of that money had gone straight into Mark's apartment deposit. He'd claimed it was seed money for his tech startup, but the business dissolved as soon as the investigation began. The CEO of the catering company pleaded guilty, took a year in federal prison, lost their license, and became a cautionary tale in nonprofit circles. My parents weren't spared either. 18 months in prison, $50,000 in fines, and a complete implosion of their social standing. The people who used to greet them in the grocery store now turned away. The church they'd attended for years quietly dropped them from the member directory. Mark got probation and 200 hours of community service at a food bank of all places. I don't know if the irony registered with him. For Daniel and me, it was vindication. The state regulator issued a formal statement clearing us of any wrongdoing, praising our cooperation in the investigation, and commending our commitment to the safety of the people we served. Donors who had paused their support came back. Volunteers returned with open arms. I'll never forget the day the board voted unanimously to reaffirm Daniel's leadership. The meeting ended with applause that felt different from any I'd heard before, louder, warmer, like the sound of something being repaired. When I walked into the shelter's kitchen that afternoon, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Volunteers laughed while chopping vegetables. Someone had brought in homemade bread. The atmosphere felt alive again, messy, noisy, human. And for the first time in months, I believed we could move forward without looking over our shoulders. If you've ever fought to clear your name, you know that moment when the truth finally lands. It's not loud, it's not triumphant, it's just steady. Share your steady moment in the comments. I think people need to hear what it feels like when the storm actually passes. Of course, life doesn't wrap up in neat little endings. There was still the matter of what came after the quiet days, the absence of phone calls, and the space where my family used to be. The quiet after the storm was both a relief and a reckoning. For the first time in years, my phone stopped buzzing with family drama, late-night emergencies, and veiled requests for money. There were no more surprise visits, no more awkward dinners where I had to pretend everything was fine, while silently calculating how much the evening would cost me in more ways than one. The silence was clean, but it was also undeniable proof that my relationship with my parents and with Mark was over. Not in the maybe someday we'll talk again way, but in the there's no way back from this way. Daniel noticed it too. One morning as we walked into the shelter together, he said, "You've been sleeping better." It wasn't a question. I admitted. No 3 a.m. wake-ups wondering what I'll find out next. At work, things felt lighter. Donors who had once hesitated were now stopping by in person, shaking hands, thanking us for standing our ground. Volunteers told us they were proud to be part of an organization that wouldn't compromise its principles. Yet every so often I'd catch myself thinking about my parents, how they might be adjusting to prison life, whether Mark was actually doing his community service or finding ways to dodge it. I didn't miss them exactly, but I missed the version of them I used to believe in. One afternoon, an envelope arrived at the shelter addressed to me. The handwriting was unmistakable, my mother's. I didn't open it. Not out of anger, but because I knew whatever it contained wouldn't change anything. The story was over. The damage was done. I put the envelope in my desk drawer unopened and went back to the kitchen. That night, I stayed late to help close up. The radio played something upbeat and silly. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, and the air was full of the scent of fresh bread. One of the newer volunteers was showing another how to chop onions without crying, laughing at her own bad jokes. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, the noise, the warmth, the feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Daniel came up beside me. "Feels good, doesn't it?" "It does," I said. "It's ours again." Because that was the real victory, not just clearing our names, not just surviving the smear campaign, but reclaiming the space, the work, and the mission we'd almost lost. And if you've ever had to cut ties to protect what matters, you know that the hardest part isn't letting go, it's learning to live fully in the space you've cleared. Tell me in the comments, what did you fill yours with? The final chapter wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about building something worth protecting and knowing I'd never let anyone, family, or not jeopardize it again. In the months that followed, the shelter became more than just a place that served meals. It became a living testament to the idea that doing the right thing matters, even when it costs you. Every morning, I'd arrive to find the kitchen already buzzing. Volunteers laughing over coffee clients, sharing stories at the tables, the steady rhythm of knives on cutting boards. It was the sound of life continuing, of trust, slowly knitting itself back together. I found myself breathing easier, smiling without realizing it, and sleeping through the night without the weight of unanswered questions pressing against my chest. The anxiety that had followed me like a shadow was gone. Sometimes people would ask if I regretted it, turning in my own family, letting them face the consequences. My answer was always the same: no. Because protecting what's right isn't betrayal, it's loyalty to something bigger than yourself. Daniel and I didn't just rebuild the shelter's reputation, we strengthened it. Donors came back bringing friends, new volunteers signed up. The people we served noticed too. They'd tell us you didn't give up on us, and those words stuck deeper than any headline. One chilly morning, as I ladled soup into a bowl, I looked out the window. The sun was just breaking over the rooftops, turning the frost on the ground into gold. I realized then that I'd stopped waiting for the next crisis. I was living in the moment again. This chapter of my life had closed, and that was okay. Because some endings aren't about loss, they're about clearing the way for something better. And in the warmth of that kitchen, with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter all around me, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be.